There's something Ray Manzarek said in an interview in 2012, 1 year before his own death, that went largely unnoticed at the time. The journalist had asked the question that journalists always asked in those late interviews: what do you most wish people understood about Jim Morrison that they don't? And Manzarek had paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "There's something Jim told me the last time we were alone together that I have never repeated. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because it belonged to him, and I think I'll keep it a little longer." The pause lasted long enough that the journalist had begun to wonder whether an answer was coming at all. Manzarek was in his mid-70s by then, his health already compromised by the illness that would take him the following year, and he had the quality of attention of someone who has decided to spend his remaining time carefully, not filling silences because silences make other people uncomfortable, but letting them exist until the right words arrived or until it became clear that the right words weren't going to arrive, and that was itself a kind of answer. He kept it. He died in May 2013 without repeating it. And the thing Jim Morrison had confided to Ray Manzarek in what turned out to be their final private conversation, sometime in late 1970, before Jim left for Paris, remained exactly where Manzarek had placed it: held, protected, returned to the person it came from by the simple act of not being spoken aloud again. This is the story of what we know about that conversation, of what the surrounding evidence suggests it contained, and of what it means that Ray Manzarek, the man who had known Jim Morrison longer and more completely than almost anyone alive, chose to carry something of Jim's in silence until his own silence became permanent. It is, by its nature, an incomplete story. The center of it, the specific content of the confession Jim made to Manzarek, is gone, preserved by the very act of preservation that makes it significant. What remains is the shape of the thing: two men in a room at the end of a particular chapter, one of them saying the true thing finally, the other receiving it with the quality of attention that made the saying possible. The shape is enough. Shapes sometimes carry more than content. Ray Manzarek and Jim Morrison met in the summer of 1965 on a Venice Beach rooftop. Jim was singing words he had been writing in private, and Manzarek heard the music inside the poetry before Jim had fully recognized it himself. From that rooftop encounter to the dissolution of the Doors and Jim's departure for Paris, Manzarek was the person inside Jim's professional life who came closest to understanding the distance between the performer and the poet, between the figure the world had decided Jim Morrison was and the person Jim actually believed himself to be. This was not an accident. Manzarek was himself an artist of serious intelligence, trained as a musician with a genuine understanding of structure and composition, and he approached Jim's mind with the respect that one serious artist brings to another. He did not consume the mythology. He knew the person inside it. In the years that followed, as the Doors became one of the most successful rock acts in America, that foundational understanding was tested repeatedly. Fame changes the conditions of friendship in ways that are difficult to resist even when both parties understand what is happening. Manzarek watched this happen with Jim and worked consistently and with considerable skill to remain in the space that predated the fame, to keep available between them the quality of exchange that had existed on that Venice Beach rooftop when neither of them was anything in particular. The years of the Doors at full momentum, 1967 through 1969, were years in which that knowledge was tested repeatedly. Jim was becoming something larger than any individual person could comfortably contain, and the machinery of fame was accelerating the process in ways that made the kind of genuine private exchange that had characterized the early years increasingly difficult to sustain. The band still made music together. They still shared the specific intimacy of the recording studio, of performance, of the concentrated creative labor that produces albums, but the conversations, the actual ones, the ones between the person rather than the performer, had become rarer, more precious, harder to find the conditions for. Manzarek noticed this the way that perceptive people notice the gradual changes in someone they know well, not in a single dramatic moment of recognition, but in the slow accumulation of small differences, of silences where there used to be words, of deflections where there used to be directness. He noticed that Jim was increasingly performing even in contexts where performance was not required. that the ironic self-construction that had always been part of Jim's public presentation was beginning to colonize private space as well. He noticed and he waited because he understood that waiting, patient, non-demanding, genuinely present waiting, was what the situation called. The Miami incident of March 1969 changed things, not immediately and not in the ways that the press coverage suggested. The legal consequences were real and complicated, but what Manzarek observed in Jim in the weeks and months following Miami was something more interior and more significant than the legal situation alone could account for. He observed a man who had been jolted into a kind of honesty about himself that the ordinary management of his career had been preventing. The performance of the Lizard King had cracked open in Miami in a way that Jim could not simply reassemble and continue. Something had been exposed that required acknowledgement. And in the conversations that followed gradually, carefully, across the months of 1969 and into 1970, Jim began to say things to Manzarek that he had not been saying before. These conversations are documented only partially in Manzarek's own memoir and in scattered interview references. What emerges is a picture of Jim Morrison in the process of genuine self-reckoning, the uncomfortable, costly kind that happens when a person stops managing their own image even in private and tries to simply say what is true. He talked about the poetry, about how the private writing practice had been the constant underneath everything, and how he was afraid the noise of fame had begun to muffle it. He talked about Paris, not yet as a definite plan, but as an idea that kept returning. He talked about what it felt like to perform songs that had emerged from a specific private experience of loneliness, and to have those songs received as party anthems. The notebooks that have survived from 1969 and 1970 show a person moving toward directness, the lines becoming shorter, the images more specific, the personal pronoun appearing more frequently, less protected by the third-person distance that poetry can provide. Jim was beginning to say I in a way that meant himself rather than a constructed persona, and this shift was visible to Manzarek, who read the work carefully and understood what it indicated. And he talked, Manzarek later indicated, about something more personal than any of this. Something that Manzarek described as Jim finally saying the thing he had always been circling. What that thing was, Manzarek did not say. He was asked in several interviews over the years and deflected each time with the same patient precision, not denying that there was something, not pretending the conversation had been ordinary, but declining to translate it into the public domain. He said once that Jim had trusted him with it, and that the trust was the point. He said once that it was the kind of thing that, once said aloud to someone who genuinely receives it, doesn't need to be said again. He said in the 2012 interview that he had been carrying it for 40 years, and that it had not become lighter, but that the weight felt appropriate, that some things should be heavy to carry, because the heaviness is the measure of what they meant. The precision of his refusals across 40 years is itself revealing. He did not say he had forgotten. He did not say the conversation had been unremarkable. He said consistently that it was not his to share. This is a specific and significant claim, the claim of someone who understands that the things people tell us in confidence belong to them, not to us. Manzarek had been given something, he was keeping it, and he understood the difference. The surrounding evidence, what Jim was writing in that period, what he said to others, the shape of his final months in America, allows some informed speculation about the territory the conversation occupied. Jim was in the process, by late 1970, of separating himself from the persona that had consumed him. He was recording a woman in a rented rehearsal space rather than a studio, the configuration of a group playing for each other rather than for an industry. He was writing in his notebooks with the urgency of someone who has realized that the writing is the most essential thing and that everything else has been, at best, the context in which the writing happened. He was, in the way of someone who understands that a chapter is ending, trying to say the things that chapters don't always leave time for. The conversation with Manzarek happened in this context. Manzarek described it as taking place over several hours at night, in the kind of setting where genuine conversation becomes possible, unhurried, private, without the agenda that their professional interactions necessarily carried. He described Jim as being more direct than he had been in years, as speaking without the usual ironic layering that protected him from being too directly vulnerable. as saying something, finally and clearly, that Manzarek had been waiting to hear, not because he needed it, but because he understood that Jim needed to say it. Those who were present in adjacent spaces during Jim's final months in Lowe's Angels described a quality of intentionality in his interactions, a sense that the usual defenses had been lowered in favor of something more direct, revealing something quieter and more essential underneath. What the surrounding evidence most strongly suggests is that the confession was about fear. Specifically, the fear that Jim had identified most clearly in his private notebooks, the fear that the performer had replaced the poet, that the persona had colonized the person, that the years of constructing and inhabiting the figure of Jim Morrison had altered something fundamental in the actual Jim Morrison in ways that Paris might or might not be able to reverse. The fear stated plainly that he did not know anymore who he was when he was not performing who he was, and the corollary fear, the one that the notebooks returned to repeatedly, that asking the question might produce an answer he was not prepared to receive. Manzarek received this. He received it in the way that the best kind of listener receives a difficult thing, not with reassurance, not with the social reflex to minimize or redirect, but with the quality of attention that simply holds what has been said and lets it be the size it actually is. He did not tell Jim the fear was unfounded. He did not tell Jim that Paris would fix it. He listened and he held, and at some point he said something back, something that Jim apparently needed to hear, because Manzarek later described Jim's response as a kind of relief, the specific physical relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has finally found someone willing to carry it alongside them, even briefly. What Manzarek gave Jim was not comfort or advice or wisdom. What he gave him was the experience of being genuinely received, of having the true thing acknowledged as the true thing without qualification or revision. He let Jim's fear be the size it actually was, and in doing so, he gave Jim something that the stage had never been able to provide, the experience of being known by one person completely, without performance on either side. Jim Morrison left for Paris in March 1971. He and Manzarek did not see each other again. Jim died in Paris in July 1971, 27 years old, the poem he had been writing each morning left unfinished on a desk by a window. Manzarek received the news and, by his own account, sat alone with it for a long time before he could speak. He spent the following decades keeping the music alive, talking about Jim in interviews and memoirs with a care that never collapsed into hagiography or revisionism. He spoke about Jim as a person, complicated, contradictory, deeply human, rather than simply as an icon. And through all of it, for more than 40 years, he kept the thing Jim had told him. What does it mean to keep someone's confidence for 40 years and then choose to die with it? It means something about the nature of trust and about what it means to truly know another person. Most intimate disclosures over the course of a long life eventually find their way into the world through memoir, through interview, through the gradual loosening of the discretion that grief imposes. The fact that Manzarek did not release Jim's confession in the 4 decades between Jim's death and his own suggests that he took seriously the distinction between what belonged to him to share and what belonged to Jim. That the trust Jim had placed in him was not a possession but a responsibility, and that the responsibility did not expire with Jim's death but remained, until Manzarek's own death, a live obligation. There is something about this that illuminates both men more clearly than almost anything else in the available record. Jim Morrison spent his life searching for exactly this kind of trust, the trust of a person who would receive what he actually said rather than what they needed him to be saying. He found it in that conversation, and Manzarek honored the finding by keeping it, by understanding that the most important thing he could do with what Jim had told him was nothing, by letting the silence be the answer. The trust that Jim placed in Manzarek was the culmination of years of careful construction, years of Manzarek refusing to consume the mythology, refusing to let the fame determine the terms of their friendship. Jim trusted him because Manzarek had earned it by being consistently, patiently present to the person rather than the symbol. The confession was the return on that investment, and Manzarek's 4 years of silence was the proof that the investment had been correctly placed. The Doors' music continues to find new listeners in every generation. People encounter Light My Fire or Riders on the Storm or The End and feel something that exceeds what nostalgia alone can account for, the recognition of a voice asking questions they have been carrying without knowing how to articulate them. The recognition of someone who understood the distance between what is felt and what can be said, and refused to pretend the distance didn't exist. This is what Jim Morrison was, underneath the mythology and the leather jacket and the stage presence, a person in pursuit of honest expression who was afraid he might have lost the thread of himself somewhere inside the noise of what he had become. Who told this fear once to the person who knew him best, who was received. And Ray Manzarek kept it, 40 years in a chest of drawers that only he could open, the one private thing of Jim's that the world never catalogued or consumed or turned into a poster. The one thing that stayed exactly what it was when it was given, a confession offered in the dark between two people who had known each other since a rooftop in Venice Beach, who had made music together for years, who had watched each other change and remained, through all the change, in genuine possession of each other's actual selves. That is the story, not what was said, but the fact that it was said and held and kept, and that the keeping was itself a form of love.